Aliens Fireteam Elite came out of nowhere in late 2021. It's a cooperative third-person shooter set in the Aliens universe where you control a colonial marine and fend off waves of xenomorphs. It's the first game from Cold Iron Studios, although you wouldn't know it at first glance. At launch, it received mixed reviews from both critics and players, with it currently sitting on an average score of 68 on OpenCritic. The general consensus was that, while shooting aliens is fun, it lacked a compelling story or any replayability. Its launch was plagued with various glitches too, and there were questions around how and even if Cold Iron Studios would support the game post-launch. Now, if you ask me, this game was a victim of what I call game journalist syndrome, where a critical reviewer doesn't spend enough time with the game to understand its systems and mechanics properly. So along with discussing the pros and cons, how the game has changed since launch, and what it's like to play in 2022, this re-review will also focus on why I think many of the critics' reviews were misguided. Aliens Fireteam Elite is an online multiplayer PvE. Currently it has 3 modes, the campaign, a horde mode, and point defense, with the latter 2 only being available after you complete the campaign. The campaign is broken into 4 chapters, each containing 3 missions. Each chapter is based on a specific film in the Alien franchise, which gives them a distinct look as well as unique enemies to fight. Although exclusively a multiplayer game, the campaign does have a story. This is predominantly presented through NPCs that you can interact with. Gameplay is straightforward. Teams are made up of 3 human Fireteam members, with each player choosing from one of 6 classes. Your goal is to complete basic objectives like activating scanners while making your way to the end of each mission. You can revive fallen team members, but if one of you dies, you'll have to continue without them. Missions are simple in design. You navigate to a checkpoint and then hold it from an onslaught of enemies before progressing to the next one. Map design is mostly linear, although some sections provide a couple of paths. The game is designed with repeat playthroughs in mind, and even when replaying missions on the same difficulty, enemy placement and objective locations are often different. As you play, you level up, which unlocks new gear and loadout slots. Progression plays a central role, and I'm going to go into much more detail as to the how and why later on. As I just mentioned, this is a multiplayer-only game. It is technically possible to play on your own with bots, which is fine if you're playing on the easier settings. Once you start playing on Intense and above though, you'll really want to party up with actual people. Again, I'll explain this in more detail when I talk about what it's like to play, but basically, if you want to get the most out of this game, you'll need some friends.
Acid damage. Not encouraging. Continue your sweep.
The story consolidates lore from all of the films into a fairly typical tale. It starts out with the colonial marines receiving a distress call from a previously thought destroyed station. Once aboard the station, you quickly discover that it's been consumed by Xenos and that good old Weyland-Yutani has been up to its usual tricks. It's not particularly original, but it is interesting enough, if a little predictable, and it even includes the Siegs and company from Alien Isolation, which I thought was kind of neat. Most of the story is told through NPCs you can find in the hub. More of these become available the further into the game you get, and you can find intel scattered throughout each mission to flesh out the story further. Both the voice acting and writing isn't half bad, it's just a shame that there are no facial animations during these interactions. Knowing that this is the first game from Cold Iron Studios, and that their budget probably wasn't that of a AAA studio, it's a concession I'm happy to live with. This really isn't a narrative-focused experience though, and most of the story is completely optional. There's only a handful of pre-mission briefings that you're forced to watch, and even then you can skip through them. Overall, it's not the best story to come out of this franchise, but there's plenty of fan service here, and it should put a smile on your face if you're into the films.
Here they come!
So this might look like a generic third-person shooter, and yeah, it kind of plays like one too, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't do much to innovate, but it does serve up some intense and satisfying action. It's basically a horde mode where you fight off waves of enemies while making your way to the end of the mission. Before each mission, you choose a class that gives you access to its own unique weapons and abilities. Each class plays a role, with some being DPS focused and others being focused on defense. There are lots of different enemy types, from the basic runner Xenos that attack in swarms, to the big boys/girls that require teamwork to take down. Later in the game you'll take on synthetics too, which require a completely different approach. Obtaining new and better gear is a fundamental part of this game. The base arsenal is still fun and effective to use, but grinding to unlock better gear and more powerful perks is important because you'll need them to tackle the harder difficulties. The default difficulty setting is standard, which presents a decent challenge when you're just starting out, but after you unlock a few new weapons and perks, you'll start to feel overpowered. This is a sign you're ready for the intense setting, and this is where the real game begins. I love that the devs actually tell you this is how they intended the game to be played. On intense and higher, friendly fire is turned on, aliens do more damage, and you have to be way more careful of acid. It demands a much higher level of coordination from your team too. On standard, everyone can kind of just run around doing their own thing, but on intense and beyond, coordination is key. Each Fireteam member needs to communicate what they're doing so that everyone else can either provide assistance or keep out of their way. The last thing you want to do is walk in front of your teammate and receive an impromptu barbecue. Having a well-rounded team is much more important when playing on the harder settings, and these requirements change from mission to mission. Some really benefit from having a technician to manage choke points, whereas having a doctor heal can be extremely useful in the later levels. On top of this, you'll need to have solid map knowledge. Understanding the layout so that you can pick an advantageous spot to take a stand will be the difference between success and failure. Basically, playing it on the harder settings is almost like playing a different game entirely. It changes it from being a fun arcadey shooter to a strategy-based survival game. It should come as no surprise then that having at least one friend to play this with is the ideal scenario. On the easier settings it's less of an issue, and playing with randoms is still entertaining. When it comes to taking on the more challenging missions and difficulties though, it becomes clear pretty soon that communication and coordination are vital. The matchmaking is usually pretty good at finding other people to play with on casual and standard, but it struggles when set to intense and higher, most likely because there are fewer people playing at this level. Unfortunately, there is no crossplay. There is cross-generational play, so Xbox One can play with Xbox Series' and PS4 can play with PS5. It would be awesome if crossplay could be patched in at some point, although there's currently no word on that. If the matchmaking can't match you with other players, you'll get bots assigned to your Fireteam. These aren't bad as far as AI companions go, but beyond standard, they're not fantastic because you can't communicate with them, pick their loadouts, or even give them basic instructions. Now, many reviewers have said that this game lacks a compelling reason to replay missions. I call bullshit on that. Replaying missions is essential for unlocking new weapons, attachments, and earning XP and credits. Many weapons can only be unlocked by playing on the harder settings. Credits allow you to purchase new weapons, attachments, perks, modifiers, as well as cosmetic items. You can also purchase single-use consumables, such as sentry turrets and mines. These are necessary for the harder missions and are immensely satisfying to see in action. Along with new gear, you'll also unlock challenge cards that you can apply to any mission. These add modifiers that can change anything from your abilities and resources to the types of enemies you encounter, and some even buff your stats, like giving you more health. If completed successfully, these challenges reward you with XP and credit boosts, and they also do a good job of keeping repeat playthroughs feeling fresh. Some of them are really entertaining as well. There are daily and weekly challenges too, which are essential to keep an eye on if you want to rank up as quickly as possible. Now, progression does feel slow and trivial at first because the individual items you unlock don't appear to make much difference. Over time, you'll figure out how to stack them to build really powerful and specialized loadouts. The loadout system is initially quite overwhelming. There are so many things to keep track of, and the perk grid isn't the most intuitive system to get to grips with. Some kind of basic tutorial or explanation of what it all means would have helped out a lot here. Now, you're going to spend a lot of time in the loadout menu because there is a shit ton of weapons, attachments, perks, and modifiers. There are literally hundreds of different loadout possibilities, so understanding how everything fits together is essential if you want to progress through the game and play on the harder settings. I think this is a really important concept to grasp. This game is heavily focused on unlocking new gear and optimizing your class setup. Beyond the standard difficulty, this is not a casual shoot 'em up. The game design and presentation might make it look like a typical third-person shooter, but if you want to get the most out of this game, learning how to maximize progression and putting together an effective loadout is unavoidable. And that's why I've spent so much time explaining this component. If you're not down with replaying missions and unlocking better gear, then you might find what's here lacking in substance. Beyond the campaign, you have a Horde mode and also point defense. At the time of making this video, Horde mode only has one map. It's not a bad map or a bad mode, although you can't help but feel that a few new locations would make it more interesting. There's also only one map in point defense. As the name suggests, it has you defending 3 points simultaneously, a bit like domination. It's pretty entertaining with 2 other people, but unfortunately, you can't really play it with bots. While you can fire up a game with AI companions, they aren't very useful for the same reasons that they're not that useful in the campaign. I would have actually preferred to see point defense integrated into the main game, rather than it being a standalone mode. Some of the mission design in the campaign is lacking in imagination, and I think this approach, which demands a high level of coordination and communication, would have added another layer of depth to the proceedings. Now, you can use your consumables in both of these modes, and additionally they have their own credits, which you can spend during a game on items. I haven't spent a huge amount of time in either of these modes, but the credit system seems to be a bit stingy. Maybe I'm just not good enough to need extra consumables, because you only earn enough to buy a couple per round. Point defense and horde mode are definitely fun distractions from the main event. Hopefully both of them will see support in future updates, because I'm not convinced that people will continue to play them otherwise. So, while we're on the topic of updates, let's talk about DLC. So you might be wondering if any of this game's DLC is pay to win. There are a handful of packs that you can purchase with real money that mainly contain cosmetic items, which also include challenge cards, consumables, and credits. There is one gun locked behind DLC, but it's not that great. What you can purchase with credits is quite limited when it comes to weapons and perks, and the best gear has to be unlocked by completing missions and finding caches. So far, the game has received 2 free updates. These seasonal updates have added new weapons, attachments, challenge cards, modes, features, cosmetic items, and a new class. Beyond this, there are 2 more seasons of content coming. In addition to more of everything just mentioned, these promise to add new modes, perks, and a new kit. Now, I wanted to take a moment to explain why I think this game didn't review that well. I think the main reason a lot of games don't review well is because of how gaming journalists often have to blitz through them, rather than being able to take their time. I think this is particularly true in the case of Aliens Fireteam Elite. I noticed from a lot of the video reviews that I watched that their gameplay was captured in the easiest modes. This means they potentially didn't experience the game as it was intended to be played, and completely missed out on how it changes and demands more from you on the harder settings. Case in point, the IGN review goes as far to say, "It's weird having experience points, levels, and RPG-like elements when all of it amounts to little more than boring passive buffs. Sure, slight increases to a pulse rifle's damage are fine, but it's not compelling to make me want to replay missions ad nauseum as if this was Destiny, and no new strategies open up as a result. If they had spent more than a few hours with the game, they'd realize how overpowered you become once you start unlocking new weapons, attachments, and perks. Like, with the Technician you can upgrade the turret to a flamethrower, which is incredibly effective but only at close range, meaning you'll have to find new and creative places to put it and alter your team's strategy around that." Gaming Bolt's review stated that, "There is a fair bit of variety in the roster of enemies, but in the heat of battle you don't necessarily need to be tactical in your approach, and everything just essentially boils down to pumping Xenos with hot lead until they stop moving. Sure, this might work on casual or even standard, but on intense and higher you really have to pay attention to things like acid spray, friendly fire, and heavies that rush you down. These all require teamwork and strategies beyond simply point and shoot." Look, I'm not trying to dunk on those reviewers or say that their opinions are wrong. I'm just saying that I don't think many of them were able to spend enough time with the game or play it how it was intended to be played to appreciate the depth of the combat. Now, this game certainly does have issues, although compared to launch, a lot of the technical problems that other reviewers highlighted seem to be mostly fixed, at least in my experience. That said, matchmaking can still be a little temperamental. Playing with my close friends is generally fine, but I've had a few dropouts when playing with randoms from across the pond. I've had a handful of crashes too, but not to the point that I would say it's common. In-game there are occasional audio glitches, like when gun noises play on repeat or drop out entirely. Enemies will get stuck on geometry every now and then, but again, this isn't frequent enough that it hurts the overall experience. I've been playing on the PS5 and it's mostly a locked 60 frames per second. I've had the rare dip, but only when the screen is completely covered in Xenos. My friends who play on the PS4 and PS4 Pro on the other hand have complained of choppy frame rates when the action heats up, so playing on last gen is likely to be less smooth than what you've been watching in this video. Visually it's a decent looking game. None of its components stand out as amazing, but collectively I think it looks good. The lighting effects are nice, the enemy design is on point, and I like the Xeno animations. The level design from an aesthetic point of view is excellent, and fans of the Alien universe will appreciate all the details in each environment. You can tell that the people who made this game have a real reverence for the source material. The audio design is a high point. All the expected sounds from the films are here, such as the weapon noises and the authentic hissing and screaming from the Xenos. The music is a bit hit and miss. Most of it feels like a perfect fit, like something that you would find in the first 2 films. Then there are other pieces of music that sound like they were stolen from one of the Ewok movies. Again though, as a whole, I think it mostly works. The UI design is not great. I really hate this cursor approach for console games, and this rollover dialogue that gives you more info is just as horrible as it was in Cyberpunk. I'm guessing this is some kind of off-the-shelf solution because I've seen it in a few games, and given that this is the developer's first game, I understand the need to focus on things like gameplay over cutting-edge interface design. It is functional, I suppose, and at the end of the day, it does get the job done. And all in all, Aliens Fireteam Elite definitely looks and sounds the part. This is a game I don't feel got a fair assessment from the critics at launch. Sure, it's a little rough around the edges, but not when it comes to the moment-to-moment action. I think if you're not a fan of the Aliens universe and or have a lot of experience with other similar Horde-type games like Left 4 Dead, then this might come across as a bit meh. There's a really deep game here for those willing to put the time in though, and for the $40 to $60 asking price, depending on where you live, I think this is a supremely underrated little game. If you enjoyed this video, why not drop it a like, and if you didn't, a dislike. If you want to know when I put out a new video, hit that subscribe button and the bell notification too. And if you want to support the channel and see some behind the scenes stuff, head on over to the Patreon page. Otherwise, thanks for your time.